And I'm Ron Green, and I'm in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies here at Coastal, and I specialize in Buddhism. And Dr. McKeever Floyd pointed out to me at some time that we have now in our department specialists in all of the large religious traditions. And it seemed to me, and after talking to Ms. Lackey and the Jackson Center people, that this would be a great venue to bring people to talk about that specialization and the important topic of peace. And so now we're right after 9/11, so this is the perfect time to talk about Islam and peace. So this series is called Living in Peace, Insights from World Religions, and what we hope to do is have one of these talks in the middle of the month, every month for this term, and every month next term if it turns out that people are actually coming and interested. So right now we have 3 scheduled. This one on Islam, and next month on Judaism, and then the following month, Dr. McKeever Floyd will talk about a younger religion, the Baha'i faith. So let me read this to you because I can't remember all of the good stuff without Dr. Finnegan. But to introduce her, Eleanor Finnegan received a PhD in religion at University of Florida in 2011, so just this summer she finished. But she's been with us at Coastal for a year and done a really good job. She earned an undergraduate degree in religious studies from Colgate University and a master's in theological studies from Vanderbilt with a focus on Islamic studies. So even though she comes from Boston, she's told me that she seems like she's becoming a Southerner with this Vanderbilt in Florida State. She's recipient of a FLAS grant, a Foreign Language and Area Studies grant, which is the Department of Education Title VI grant to study languages, and her language she studied was modern Arabic. Her research interests include American Islam and Muslims, the relation between Muslims' religious and environmental ideas and practices. Her publications include What Traditions Are Represented in Religion and Ecology, a perspective from an American scholar of Islam. A case study, Images of Land Among Islamic Farmers in the U.S. And Representing, that's not just my southern accent, the G's not there, Representing Women, Signification of Women's Body in Muslim Hip-Hop. As well as she's also contributed to several encyclopedias and journals. Her dissertation focused on farming among American Muslim communities. So what I thought that we would do, and I spoke with Dr. Finnegan about it, is have her talk for about 30 minutes and then take questions after that. So,
all right, great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see so many people here and that so many people are interested and that you are not all just from my class here to get extra credit. So that's a plus. So I was quite pleased when Dr. Green asked me to participate in this series of lectures. I didn't realize at the time basically how timely it was going to be, right? We've just had the 10-year anniversary of 9/11. And that's one event that usually causes us to have a lot of discussion about Islam and peace, or at least Islam and violence. Okay, so I was excited about having the opportunity to talk about peace because I feel like we talk about the violence side of things more than we do the peace side. However, I'm also not the foremost expert on Islam and peace, as you can tell from my bio. My specialties lie elsewhere, but it was very interesting to try to think about the issue of peace from my position as a scholar, from my interests as a scholar, from the point of view of the communities that I've gone and I've studied. So Islam and peace has come up in my graduate work. It's also come up quite a bit in my teaching. Okay, so I taught Introduction to Islam back at University of Florida before I came here, and I usually have students do group projects, and they're allowed to pick anything that they want in the world to be a topic. I always get a group that wants to talk about just war theory. Okay. When I went to one of the Sufi communities that I focused on for my dissertation, during one of my visits, they gave me a book that's basically a compilation of teachings from their sheikh, which is their religious teacher, and it's called Islam and Peace, and it's actually the best-selling book that they publish. So people really want to talk about Islam and peace. But it seems to me that when I was doing my research, given my experiences, There are limitations in terms of how we talk about the topic of Islam and peace. We tend to define peace in what scholars have described as basically a modern Western kind of a way. We usually describe peace as being the absence of violence. And this is part of the reason why we then get this focus on just war theory. We get the focus on talking about topics like jihad, which oftentimes gets translated as holy war, which also sometimes gets translated as struggle. And there are some problems and some limitations that come up when we talk about Islam and peace this way, when we specifically define peace this way. Okay, this kind of definition overlooks traditional Islamic ideas about what peace actually is. Okay, within the Islamic tradition, there is a tradition of talking about peace in broader kinds of terms. Now, it matters how we describe this term because ideas about what peace is shapes the kinds of activities that can be used to help bring about peace. It shapes ideas about who can cause changes. It also limits the kinds of ideas, resources, and inspirations that we might find within the Islamic tradition in terms of promoting peace. Talking about just war theory is a very legal approach to the issue. Okay, it's focused primarily on ideas that have come about in Sharia, in articulations of Islamic law. Okay, it also limits the activities or the methods that can be used to promote peace. Okay, and it also can have ramifications for religious ideas that don't seem directly related to ideas about peace. Okay, in fact, one idea that it has ramifications for is the relationship of God to creation. It limits actually God's role in the world if you limit your definition of what it means to have peace or to be peaceful. All right, so the challenge I put forth for myself today is attempting to bring you guys a presentation where we don't talk about just the absence of violence, where actually we try to sort of avoid it somewhat. Okay, there's going to be a question and answer at the end, so you can ask then, but how do we move our discussion of peace beyond just talking about the absence of violence or the justification of violence, right? When is it okay to be violent? And so in order to do this, I needed to narrow down the sort of sources we were going to look at. All right, Islam and peace is a giant topic. This is a tradition that has existed for a long time. There's quite a few textual resources. There's also quite a few Muslim communities. Okay, these textual sources end up being interpreted through historic communities. So what I want to look at today is I want to look at some of the foundational texts within the Islamic tradition, and I also want to look at the interpretation of some Sufi communities. I have experience actually out in the field, hanging out with groups of American converts to Islam who have communities who have talked quite a bit about peace and who are also attempting to have communities and live in ways that actually can be seen as attempts at bringing about peace or sort of advancing peace. Okay, so I'm looking primarily at ideas, a little bit about practices in the Sufi communities. However, when we talk about ideas from the textual tradition, it's important to remember that you're always getting a version of an interpretation. Okay, there's been lots of different Muslim communities that have lots of different histories, lots of different cultures, lots of different economic and political systems as well. All right, so to help set up the context for understanding what we're going to talk about, I need to tell you a little bit about what Sufism is or who Sufis are. Okay, Sufis are practitioners of Islam who partake in something we call Sufism. This is considered to be the mystical branch of the Islamic tradition. Okay, they are concerned with experiencing God. All right, they are trying to learn about God, learn about God's will, live according to God's will, but also to have some kind of direct sort of revelationary type of experience. Okay, so part of the reason to look at them is it plays to my strengths. I know a bunch about Sufis. The other reason, however, is that Sufi groups tend to highlight some of the diversity within the Islamic tradition. Okay, again, a lot of the times why we focus on things like the legal tradition is that it seems like it can speak for all Muslims without speaking about particular ones. And I think that's a little bit of a problem in how we talk about peace. All right. I've got to put in a little bit of a disclaimer. A lot of times people like to talk about Sufis as an example of good, peaceful Muslims versus all other Muslims that are bad. That's not what I'm trying to attempt to do here, okay? And you'll see this in the media sometimes. I just want to say that we've got these multiple ways of interpreting, and so we're going to look at Sufis in particular, in part because they have a very different idea about what peace is in the specifics of how you go about cultivating it as compared to other attempts such as reform attempts at peace, renewal attempts at peace, which tend to be these sort of legalistic, and attempts at peace through political power, okay, which sounds sort of like a oxymoron, if you will. So, Sufis are unique Muslim groups, but they do draw on some of the same traditions as other Muslims. Now, it's important to note, too, there is a major division among Muslim communities. We have Sunnis and we have Shias. You probably have all heard these two words before. There's a disagreement about leadership in the community, basically, is where they split, and now there's a lot of difference in beliefs and difference in practices. A lot of times people want to present Sufis as a third kind. They're not. All right, you're going to have Sunni Sufis or you're going to have Shia Sufis. They're going to fall within this collective tradition. And so part of the inspiration that they draw upon, that all other Muslims draw upon, are foundational texts, okay? The Quran, which is the sacred text within the Islamic tradition that's considered to be the word of God. The Hadith, which is the example of the Prophet. Sometimes people will refer to this as the Sunnah. And then also sometimes people will claim, Muslims will claim, the legal tradition is a foundational kind of a text, okay? That one's up for debate. Quran and Hadith, these are certainly foundational to being a Muslim, all right? That's pretty much where most people agree. The interpretations of them, however, are going to be different, okay? Within particular communities, there are also other sources of authority. Within the Sufi community, they also turn to the example of their sheikhs. Their sheikhs are seen as being an embodiment, their teachers, of the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So in some ways, it's like a living example of the Hadith that they work with, or a once living example of the Hadith, because some of their teachers have passed. Okay, so this makes their organization different. They join groups that are based on a lineage of teachers. They also have different kinds of practices, all right? Because they are attempting to experience God, they have practices called zikr, which are remembrance. So if you've ever heard of whirling dervishes, when the dervishes whirl, this is a form of zikr. This is a form of trying to understand what God wants from us. Okay. So to get back to the issue of peace, now that we have a little bit of this background, there have been scholars that have argued that really a textual Islamic idea about peace is defined as God, basically. Okay, this is slightly different than the usual definition of an absence of violence or civil discord. Okay, according to the Quran, God has 99 names, and these 99 names are the characteristics of God, and one of God's names is peace. All right, so this should seem easy. I've now defined peace. It, however, gets very complicated then in terms of what it means to try to cultivate peace if God is peace. Okay, so if God is peace, how does one live peacefully or work towards creating peace? Much of the thought on how this happens is focused on the particular connections that God has with creation. Okay. An important idea is something called tawhid, which is unity of existence. This is an idea that's been interpreted in many different ways. In Sufi communities, it applies to all aspects of life. We're all interconnected as people. We're also interconnected with nature through the divine. Okay. There's also the sense that there's some kind of all-encompassing knowledge of God and some kind of all-encompassing will of God. Okay? Some will argue that it actually means that our reality is the divine. Okay? This gets into particular interpretations. All right? But there's this focus on the interrelatedness and the presence of the divinity, whether this is filtered down or whether this is because all of existence is infused with the divine, in terms of how we need to think about being peaceful. Okay? The Quran also explains that there's a balance or there's a harmony to existence as God has laid out existence. Okay, so oftentimes for Sufi, peace is characterized as living according to God's will or trying to harmonize oneself with God. Okay? So, because of this interconnection with everything, and because of this desire to promote harmony, the onus falls on people to basically, as individuals, attempt to promote harmony. Okay? If I improve my relationship to the divine, Sufis teach, this will help me experience peace. But this will also help all of creation. Okay? We've got to promote harmony in our interactions with God, with other people, and also with the environment. Okay, so now we're sort of expanding the area in which we need to be concerned about striving for justice. Justice also becomes a very important theme in terms of Sufi thinking about peace. All right. The other two ideas that are important is that as people, we have some freedom. Okay, so there's a divine will, which might sound like there's predestination, but we do have some freedom in our decisions. The other thing is we also have particular responsibilities as people. All right, so we have a slightly different role in this than, say, like a cat does. All right, so although there's a focus on the individual within the Sufi tradition, there are also other ways that Sufis go about harmonizing with God, or basically attempting to bring about peace. Okay, Sufis are concerned with unveiling, so removing distractions between yourself and God. Also, in terms of maturing spiritually, so removing blocks within yourself that's preventing you from harmonizing with God and everything around you. And there's also oftentimes a focus on love and on beauty. Okay, now, in my fieldwork, I actually got to go and interview people about the practices within their communities at 3 American communities that had farms, actually. All right, so there was a lot of action and a lot of activity going on in these places. They were places where people could meet and hold religious practices together. It was also places where they had to work together in community. It was also places where they had to strive for this ecological kind of harmony as well. All right, and so what I learned through studying them, talking with them, sort of participant observation is what we call it, where you go and you can sit in on meetings and things, is that there's a bunch of different ways that they attempt to harmonize, okay? Sometimes you learn things through working with other people. Sometimes you learn things through practices like zikr or practices like prayer. People brought up multiple times the feeling of peace that descends upon oneself when engaged in the actual practice of prayer, okay? In terms of sort of particular reasons why individual cultivation of peace was important, I got the following story from one of my interviewees, okay? This is an interesting story because the original question that I asked was whether or not humans had any special claim on the environment, right? Like if I had a right to go chop down as many trees as I wanted or something. And he told me that it was an arrogant idea to think that humans had a special claim to nature because we don't have control over it. However, then he launched into this explanation of the interactions of the elements that make up existence, okay? And he explained that his sheikh taught that there are 5 elements that exist in the human body, but also within nature. So it's earth, fire, air, water, and ether, all right? And if you look out actually into the environment, you'll see that these things are constantly in conflict, right? Water erodes earth. Water, destroys fire, these kinds of things. He said, though, that doesn't happen in the human. And he said that the reason that this doesn't happen is because we have a soul, right? The soul basically keeps everything at peace with each other. So what happens is, when people are not peaceful within themselves, the environment around you can't be peaceful either, all right? And so this teacher actually gave this as an example of why we have natural disasters, okay? Now this is an interesting kind of story because it sounds like sort of humanity is the key, right, to everything being peaceful, hooray, we're the victors who can impose this on others, right? However, what he said was, we need to do this with a humbleness. It's almost as if we're not in control of the soul part of ourselves. This is the piece of ourselves that has to be tuned towards the divine. Okay, so this is a particular idea about peace that comes from a sheikh, that comes from a teacher. Now, a sheikh is thought to have special religious insight, in part because they have aligned themselves with the divine, also in part because they're part of a lineage of wisdom that's been passed down from the prophet. Okay. I also got to learn a lot about how they were trying to harmonize themselves with nature, given sort of the focus of my project. And this provides some other interesting ideas about areas where we find ideas about peace. Okay, one of the things that they were attempting to do on these farms was to manage their land in a sustainable way. So not all of them were growing food. Some of them were, but they were attempting to have this sort of sustainable relationship where they weren't damaging the soil, they weren't sort of using a lot of chemicals and things. Nobody was organic, but they were trying to work towards this. And they had sort of two explanations for why this was the proper sort of relationship to have with nature. And sometimes it was because their sheikh basically sat them down and told them this was what they were supposed to do, all right? The other reason, however, was due to ideas found in the Quran about the rights of nature. Okay, so animals, they form communities like us. Animals are actually, or plants are actually believers. Okay, the word for Islam means to submit. A Muslim is someone who submits, and oftentimes scholars will say an Islamic idea of peace is about submitting to God. All right, so animals and plants, they also submit to God, and thus this gives them certain kinds of rights. However, we also have the responsibility to do things like actually cultivate land. All right, so there's still this sort of division in terms of there's a celebration of diversity, but there's also the idea that there is going to be some kind of conflict, all right? It's not really presented that way, but it's a Sufi's job to attempt to figure out the best use for a land. And so this is, again, part of this idea of needing to have humility, needing to be mindful of God, but that also introduces ideas that there are still problems in terms of competing interests when dealing with issues of peace. Okay. So, basically what I hope you can see from some of my descriptions is that we've now, when we look at peace beyond just the absence of violence or the absence of civil discord, we begin to expand the kinds of relationships that we need to be concerned about cultivating in terms of peace, okay? And in a very sort of foundational way, this links back to God. But there's going to be ideas in the Quran, but there's going to be very different types of interpretations that are made in terms of how we are to attempt to cultivate these relationships. Now, one of the things that's also interesting with the examples of Sufis is because we have these foundational texts, if these are ideas that can eventually be traced back to the Quran, they may be able to serve as inspiration for other, Muslim communities as well. So I think that's kind of my major points. I guess I would be willing to, open it up to questions both about what I've spoken on, but also in terms of, other issues that we didn't get to as well. Here and then John.
What is the relative percentage of Sufi Muslims as opposed to?
The relative percentage. That's really difficult to talk about. There used to be a very high percentage of Muslims who were Sufi. So in sort of the classical Islamic period, we have a very high participation. We begin to get less with the onset of modernity. And partially, one of the critiques of Muslim societies was that Sufism, because it was mystical, was sort of backwards and superstitious and wasn't going to be able to keep up with sort of social and technological kinds of advances. So we get a real move away from Sufism starting then. And this leads actually to the active persecution of Sufi groups. In terms of numbers nowadays, we still have very high participation in areas in like the Indian subcontinent, in places like Indonesia, in places like Morocco, but also in some areas that are very stringent in terms of having a state ideological stance on what correct Islam is. So for example, Saudi Arabia, we have a very low kind of open participation in Sufism. There actually was an article the other day. Sufi groups are making a resurgence in Saudi Arabia, and actually Muslim majority communities are beginning to focus on cultivating Sufi ideas and Sufi groups because they see them as a potential check to fundamentalism. So I don't have numbers, but it's a fairly significant ideological stance still within the Muslim community, I would say, at the very least.
The movement toward reinvigorating Sufism, is that perhaps a means by which they seem to want to appeal to the general populace, kind of world religion at large? Or is it more so just within the Muslim community?
We see it in both. So in a place like the US, there's been a real interest in Sufi thought. There's actually historically been a real interest in Sufi thought in the West, and this is also partially due to developments in scholarship. So when Europeans went out and began studying Muslim communities, they separated sort of legalistic, what they saw as bad Islam, into Islam, and then the things that they liked about Islam, they put into the category of Sufi. So Sufism has, for a very long time, appealed to Westerners. Actually, one of the top-selling poets in the United States is someone named Rumi, who's a 13th century Sufi writer, actually. He writes about love, and they're very beautiful poems, but he's really talking about the divine. But here in the U.S., recently there has been a renewal of interest in Sufism, I would say, yes, because of this desire to sort of speak to universal religious truths. A lot of times Sufism will say that they're speaking to religious ideas that transcend the particular languages of world religions. But in the example of, say, a place like Saudi Arabia, it's actually to appeal to Muslims and to provide alternatives to very sort of fundamental kinds of interpretations of Islam. Yeah, John.
So I'm very interested in this notion of peace as being something more than simply the absence of violence. In other words, something more than a negative concept, as we would say in philosophy. There's a positive concept to it as well. And I think that's really cool. So thank you for bringing my attention to it. For Muslims, for Islam, as far as I can tell, the notion of peace then is pretty closely linked to religious concepts as a whole, which is not shocking, of course. But that does lead me to wonder, what do they think about the non-religious? Do they think that the non-religious can be peaceful? Do they think that they are, and I'm trying to not focus on political turmoil, but just if they meet non-religious people, what do they think?
No, that's a great question, and that brings up something that I actually skipped that I want to talk about. Normally, sort of the convention within religious studies as you read a paper. It's really boring to listen to. So I have an outline, but I'm not great about following it. This is a great question. There's, in some sense, a real celebration of diversity within the Quran. And there is a sense that not everyone needs to be a Muslim to fulfill God's will. All right, now, particular interpretations of this by particular Muslim communities, this is going to get difficult, right? Because we do have historically the persecution of non-Muslims by Muslims and the persecution of Muslim minorities by Muslim majority groups. But there is something present in Islamic religious thought that says basically there's no compulsion in religion. And basically, sometimes you need non-believers to help other people find God. So in a way, they're fulfilling sort of their God-given role. But I think that there is the potential, because we see it historically, but also when we begin to look at the environmental example, since that's, sort of what I know the most about, that there is still sort of this hierarchy, right? Nature doesn't matter as much as humans. Muslims are going to have a different role in this potentially than non-Muslims. So there is space for that, but there's also space for there to be exclusion there. Yeah.
I like this idea of peace, but I just have a couple questions about it in general.
Mm-hmm.
And so far as like these Muslims are concerned, like, is peace just this moral ideal that they live up to, or is it actually attainable? And if so, is it a perpetual kind of peace, or is it just sort of, oh, I have peace for a few minutes until I'm not happy anymore? What is that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's probably one issue with taking a particularly Sufi approach to the idea of peace. Peace is an ideal. You can, in some sense, achieve perpetual peace. I think that you could argue that that's what sheikhs have achieved because they have harmonized basically with God. However, there is this aspirational piece to it. There's also a trend within Sufism that part of the way that you're going to achieve this peace is that you've got to flout social conventions and social norms. And so this can be achieved in many different ways. They think that the word for Sufism comes for the term for wool, and it was part of what they would do is they'd wear these really uncomfortable woolen garments. And then we also get the development of other Sufi groups that are a real minority who say, we don't need to follow the law because this is just a social convention that's preventing us from this interaction with God. And so they'll do things like go out and get drunk in public, which goes against what most Muslims believe. So I think you're right. It does leave the potential that peace is not something you ever fully achieve. However, this potentially has the ability to keep us mindful of always trying to work towards it. But I think that is a very good question, at least within the Sufi interpretation.
Do the Sufis equate the concept of peace then with, whereas in Buddhism maybe the concept of enlightenment?
We see some overlap in some Sufi traditions, and it's difficult to know if it's because of direct influence, because we do have Sufi communities in areas that are Buddhist majority areas. We do have Sufis, so for example, the people that I've been working with, they're mostly converts to Islam, and so they've come through other religious traditions, and so they'll use language like Buddhist kind of language. So some certainly do, and I think some would see very real parallels. I would say that some would say there's not quite so much of a connection. Yeah.
Did I understand that Sufism is not a separate kind of Islam? It's
Mm-hmm.
someone who is Shiite and someone who is Sunni can be,
Mm-hmm.
can claim Sufism.
Sufism. Mm-hmm.
So, were these communities that you visited, were they Shiite or were they?
They were primarily Sunni There's one community that never came out and said we're Shia, but based on some of their literature, I'm pretty sure that they're a Shia community because they're focused on certain kinds of figures within the religious tradition that they emulate and certain kinds of practices that made it seem like they were Shia. So you do get Sufis both within the Sunni and the Shia practice, or the Shia tradition. Yeah.
Is there some time, Shia was first,
Sunni came first. So the division between Sunni and Shia came about, it began after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, all right? So we have a community that's following the Prophet who's alive. Once he dies, they have to figure out what to do in terms of leadership, okay? And so there's a position called the Caliph, and this is actually a position that's sort of debated what it means. Are you a representative? Are you just the person who's next in line? But they also debated what kinds of qualities you needed to have to fulfill this position. And so Sunnis said anyone who's a qualified member of society, who's a good upstanding Muslim, could be the Caliph. And Shias said it's someone who needs to be related by blood to the Prophet. And so basically the idea being that this blood connection gave you some sort of, I usually describe it to my classes as religious powers. That's not a technical term, right? But religious abilities, access to a certain kind of wisdom that you wouldn't have without this connection. And so I say, it started when the Prophet died. We begin to have disagreements within the community about who should be the leader, but we don't actually get the split until a couple hundred years later. When basically it's not until the fourth ruler that we have somebody who's directly related by blood to the Prophet. They get murdered. Their son tries to avenge them once the person who murdered their father dies, and his son goes to take over, and once the son gets killed, this is basically where we get a split between the two groups.
and Sufism grew up after
And
that.
Sufism, it grows up at about the same time that we begin to see a Sunni-Shia split. And so basically Shias, what happened was, so the fourth caliph was someone named Ali. And when he was murdered, this ushered in a period of rule called the Umayyad dynasty. And basically the Umayyads, they were not necessarily great Muslim rulers. Okay, they were fairly efficient rulers, but in terms of their moral practices, they had very lavish kind of a court life and these sorts of things. And so Sufism was a movement that said we need to go back to the example of the Prophet. It wasn't about having some lush kind of empire, some wealthy sort of court life. It was about living by these tenets of providing for everyone in society and these sorts of things. And so this is where we begin to see the development of Sufism. So it's around the same time as the development of Shia Islam. So then we get them then falling into either the Shia tradition or the Sunni tradition, sort of going forward in history. Yeah, go ahead.
I realize that in modern society there has been some relaxation in Islam.
What? I'm sorry, I
And
couldn't.
there's been some relaxation in terms of women's roles in society and traditional garments and things like that. In Sufism, what is the nature of the women's role?
Yeah, so the role of women within Muslim communities is something that's very, very complicated. And in some sense, you're right. In some communities, there's been an advancement in terms of freedoms for women. But in many communities, there's been restrictions put on, actually, as Islam has historically developed. Islam's a very interesting tradition when it comes onto the scene, when Muhammad gets this revelation. In some ways, it's very radical in terms of the rights it's giving women, all right? When we get the development of a legal tradition later on, these rights are pretty much gone. In terms of the role of women within Sufism, it's complicated. Different Sufi groups, depending on their lineage, are going to follow different legal schools. Within the Sunni tradition, there's 4 legal schools that are considered valid. Within the Shia tradition, they follow their own legal scholars. Okay, and different Sufi groups are going to follow the law to a different extent, right? I mentioned that there's Sufis who go out and get drunk. They're flaunting Islamic law at that point. historically, we have the example of women teachers. So there's some Sufi women who say, I should be able to do these, I should be able to have leadership roles, I should be able to be a teacher. There are other Sufi communities where sort of women can be anything but a teacher. There's different ideas about the type of dress. Okay, so this is oftentimes a big issue, right? What Muslim women are expected to wear or should be wearing. In the Quran, it basically says women need to dress modestly. It actually says that men are supposed to do this too. And it's out of this that we get legal rulings in terms of what women are expected to wear. And so different Sufi communities, in part due to whether or not they sort of stress the particulars of the Islamic tradition or the universal nature of Sufism, they're going to have different ideas about what women wear. So at some of the communities that I went to, and now this gets more complicated also because these people are converts, so they come from a particular kind of societal expectation about, what women can do in society. I met women who would wear a hijab, which is a veil. I met women who would only do this when practicing in a mosque. I met women who would do this if they were practicing sort of anywhere, but in the rest of their lives they wouldn't. And then I met women who would be sitting around in like a tank top doing all of these things. So you get a wide range in terms of the role for women within Sufi traditions. In these communities, I would say women were in real positions of leadership, but oftentimes they weren't religious because these were farms. Sometimes they were in charge of the practices on the farm or the projects on the farm. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I understand that a lot of the reports that we see, of course, about Islam are problematic. So, with that in mind, Sunnis and Shia sometimes are in conflict, sometimes in violent conflict, even though, of course, there are exaggerations. What I wonder is how the Sufi community reacts to that, to the Sunni Shia and the Sunni, to the Sufi Shia and the Sufi Sunni. Do they coordinate? Do they ever conflict themselves? Do they ever violently conflict themselves? I'm trying to get a picture of these different sects and how they treat each other in their attempts at harmonization.
Yeah, so this is it's a complicated kind of situation, and I'm really shocked no one's asked a question about jihad yet, or, the things that I wanted to sidestep, but that usually people want to talk about. And so part of the issue in terms of talking about peace within the Islamic tradition and talking about peace between different Muslim communities, and then actually talking about peace between Muslims and non-Muslims, so even in the example of something like Al-Qaeda's ideology about when violence is justified, is the issue about sort of when you're provoked to attack. There is a tremendous amount of violence that happens between Sunnis and Shias, okay? Part of the practice for Shias is they go on pilgrimage to the sites of, they actually call their caliphs the imams, and oftentimes there are acts of violence that are perpetuated against them as they go on these pilgrimages. Part of the justification of that comes out of ideological stances on when someone is threatening what it means to be a Muslim. In terms of Sufis and inter-Muslim violence, I can't think of any real examples contemporarily, okay? There seems to be more of an attempt to get along. Historically, I think we do get some conflict. However, we do find instances in history, because oftentimes Sufis are presented as ascetics who will just remove themselves from society, not really be concerned with politics or violence or sort of the happenings of the world. But we actually get Sufi communities who are very much involved in warfare. For example, in Algeria, during the period of French colonial rule, Sufi communities became very instrumental in fighting the French. But I can think of fewer examples of where Sufis fight with each other, or they fight with Shias or Sunnis who aren't Sufi. Part of this seems to be among some of the more prominent Sufi thinkers. So there are Sufis who are sort of held up as Muslim philosophers rather than just being someone who's a teacher in your lineage. For example, someone like Ibn Arabi would be an example. They focus quite a bit on this idea that sort of there's many paths to God. And I think this is part of the reason that we see less of that within the Sufi community. Now, there's been quite a bit of violence against Sufis as well. All right? In Saudi Arabia, they follow Wahhabism, which basically teaches that Sufism, or at least used to, like I said, it's changing now, that Sufism isn't a legitimate form of Islam. And so the way that they tried to get people to stop being Sufis was that they violently persecuted them and they destroyed the places, the shrines that they would go to on pilgrimage. Yeah. Okay.
How realistic is it to expect that this peace doctrine that the Sufis teach will transfer to larger sects? I know you talked about experiences in Saudi Arabia and an effort to reach out, but in terms of the Muslim community at large, can we expect to see that kind of change?
I think we're beginning to see some of this. And now whether people are attempting to look at the idea of peace as something broader than, just war or absence of violence as a Sufi tenet, or whether they're doing it because they understand the idea of peace being something broader as just a Muslim idea, just an Islamic idea, I'm not sure. But we do find groups, I'd say, focusing on this. There's still, I think, especially due to the political climate, quite a bit of focus on peace as nonviolence. There's a lot of Muslim communities here in the U.S. that hold peace rallies or partake in peace, interdenominational kinds of peace programs where they live. So I still think that because of the need that there's some of this focus just on the issue of violence, but I do think that we can see communities getting sort of fed up with the limitations in some ways. But I'm not sure it's because they're adopting it as a Sufi kind of an idea so much as an Islamic one. All right. Do we have any other questions before we get total monopolization?
Right now in the Middle Eastern countries, with what we see as the Arab
Spring. Mm-hmm.
Are Sufis becoming politically involved? Are they having anything to do with that, or are they removed from it? How does that fit within the concept of peace?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Arab Spring has really been more of a secular kind of a movement, actually. This has been less about religion and more about the desire for things like democracy. And so I don't really have good information on terms of sort of religious identification of people who are participating in this movement, because it's not really been the motivation. So in many ways, it hasn't been what's on sort of the forefront of what people have been talking about, if that makes any kind of sense. I would say that for some Sufi groups, political action would make a whole lot of sense. For others that sort of practice more of this asceticism, this being sort of removed from the political, less so. There would be less participation. But it's a good question, but I haven't really seen information on sort of the breakdown. Yeah. Okay.
I think, the idea that peace goes beyond nonviolence, and Islam identifies peace as, the source of peace being God. Would you just discuss the potential for someone to carry out violence in the name of bringing about peace?
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
And also, something else that I'm curious about is what the role of Sharia law is, maybe in God's will to promote peace or establish a peaceful political institution or whatever. So
Yep.
you will, Sharia law as it relates to Islam
Yeah.
and
And
Islam's will to promote peace, and also the possibility for violence to be carried out in the name of establishing peace.
yeah, so there's a group of scholars that talk about this particular issue of using violence to achieve peace, right, which seems in some ways counterintuitive, who call it sort of attempts at peace from a position of political power. Okay, and so the idea being that there are political leaders who have some kind of insight into God's will because perhaps they have a board of advisors like we see in a place like Iran, where the idea is, yes, sort of in the interest of the greater good, you could perpetuate violence against your people to promote a somewhat peaceful kind of regime. We have seen this historically. This usually, however, promotes a very different idea about tawhid. So one of the reasons that this idea of the unity of existence is important is that this is also an idea that speaks to the nature of God, and not God's relationship to creation, but the idea that God's not a trinity. Okay, so oftentimes Islam is described as radical monotheism. Muslims are taught that basically Islam came about because Christians got revelation from God, but then they misinterpreted it. And then they started talking about God, the Holy Spirit, and the Son. Okay? So this idea of peace from a position of political power usually focuses on the unity of God, but then the transcendence of God from the created realm, right? From sort of the existence as we live it. So we do see that in some instances, the kinds of examples that they're talking about as being sort of examples of this phenomena, it's also partially due to sort of cultural ideas and historical circumstances. So a lot of the unhappiness in places like Egypt, places like Libya, was that there was a political system set up where it was basically a dictator who thought they knew what was best for society and would achieve those ends through violence quite often. So there is that trend within the Islamic tradition. In terms of, it was Sharia and peace, and the role of Sharia in achieving peace, that's what your question was. Sharia certainly plays a role. So what we tend to call Sharia, and I've called Sharia sort of perpetuating the problem, is actually called fiqh within Islam. And it's an attempt by humans to figure out the divine will and learn to live according to it. Okay, so God wants something for us. I'm a human though, so I can't know all of it. But as a legal scholar, there are methods for me to best figure out how we should be living. So Sharia certainly plays a role in many traditions. Basically, the existence of just war theory is primarily a legal sort of tradition, so it's something that arises out of Sharia. We see ideas developed within Islamic law in terms of how you treat non-Muslims. So this also goes back to John's question. Jews and Christians were considered people of the book. Okay, so they got revelation from God just the same as Muslims did. They had prophets just the same. They were to be treated differently than people who weren't of the book. They had certain rights and things. They had certain responsibilities too. We then find, if you fast forward in history to particular areas, Muslims trying to expand these legal ideas. So in some places in the Indian subcontinent, some Muslims want to talk about Hindus also being people of the book, because Sharia has a real authority that exists within the Islamic tradition, so it can be very persuasive, right? You can claim something like the Quran says that there's no compulsion in religion, but then it's sometimes more persuasive to say, but then we also have this legal ruling that someone who's a person of the book is deserving of certain kinds of respects. So Sharia has certainly played a role. Part of the problem, however, with Sharia or with fiqh as it's been sort of articulated currently is there's not a lot of space for interpretation within the legal system. And this is an issue that Muslim communities are grappling with. It's a process called ijtihad, which is basically reasoning, there's not a lot of this done anymore. Some people claim it's not allowed anymore, that actually the law is fixed, which makes no sense because, you know, conditions in society have changed and things. So there's also, in some sense, a limitation in Sharia as well, which I think is part of the themes I was trying to play with my presentation. But that's a very good question, because also particular articulations about things like jihad. It's an idea found in the Quran. It's built upon in terms of what the Prophet said, so in terms of the Hadith. But then we actually get legal rulings that come out of this as well. Yeah. All right, let me just one more go around. Do we have time for one more? Got like 2 minutes.
Way out of time, unless there's a burning question. Burning question?
Yeah. So I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and I realize the fundamental difference between Christianity and Judaism is that I believe in the Messiah. They're still waiting for one. How do I function in the religion of Islam? What are my rights? And why are some Jews and Christians persecuted in Islamic communities, aside from Sufism?
Yeah, so this is a long answer. But the short answer is basically Muslims also believe in Jesus. They do not believe, however, that he's the Son of God. They also don't believe, oh my goodness, what's it called? When Jesus came back alive after he was... Thank you, yes. It's been a long day. Yes, they also don't believe in the resurrection, okay? They don't believe he actually ever was crucified. He was whisked away by God, and he's actually sort of sitting up, basically, in this like waiting room, waiting to come down to usher in the end of times, okay? So there's some similarities here. In terms of your treatment within the Islamic tradition, what the Quran says, what the Hadith says, what the historic example is, what the legal tradition says, and that what Muslim communities have done all varies in some sense. At particular points in history, you're going to see Jewish and Christian communities being treated very, very well. In other historical instances, you're going to see them being not treated very well, like not being allowed to build houses of worship, having to pay a whole lot of extra tax. Nowadays, depending on where you are, so here in the US, there's sort of a lot of interfaith work, and there's a lot of people who are trying to find the commonalities between the traditions, right? The idea, for not all, but for most Muslims, Christians, and Jews, is that you're all following the same God, right? So there's people working on that, but in particular communities, you're not necessarily allowed to proselytize people. So for example, in a place like Saudi Arabia, but it's going to kind of vary by historic period, vary by community, but there is a sense that as a Christian, you're deserving of respects that somebody who's not a follower of God is. If that makes any kind of sense. That's a really short answer of like a very giant question.